There was no yelling, no crime committed. Just a black man in a suit, pulling a suitcase, and somehow that made him suspicious. Malcolm Everett had just set foot back on U.S. soil after a long flight from Brussels. He wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't arguing. He didn't stray from the walkway, but to the two police officers standing near Gate C18, he was a problem. Male black, traveling alone, looked nervous. A vague, outdated description, vague enough to apply to anyone. Precise enough to target someone like him. Officer Donald Ricks and rookie Evan Moore approached Malcolm as if they were advancing on a dangerous suspect. "Hey you, stop! Am I being accused of something? Doesn't matter. You match the description." What description exactly? Don't resist. What happened next unfolded quickly. When he asked about his civil rights, they saw it as provocation. When he stayed calm, they saw it as defiance. And when he didn't show fear, they twisted his arms behind his back and locked cold metal cuffs around his wrists. Around them, people began filming. A child cried. A woman turned away, but the officers didn't flinch. They thought they had handled a stubborn man. What they didn't know was that they had just handcuffed the director of the United States National Intelligence Center. He didn't resist. He simply looked them in the eye and said coolly, "You just made a serious mistake." They didn't know who they had just arrested. But they were about to find out, and they would regret it. He didn't struggle. He didn't curse. Malcolm Everett just stood there, hands cuffed, head held high, eyes calm as forged steel. An ordinary man might have crumbled under the weight of such public humiliation. But Malcolm was no ordinary man. He was the director of the United States National Intelligence Center, a position second only to the National Security Council in terms of intelligence influence. The man they had just handcuffed held the keys to some of the most classified secrets in America. Malcolm was born in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, in a neighborhood where whites-only signs had come down just a few years prior, but their spirit still clung to every brick. His father was a Marine Corps veteran who'd served in Vietnam. He returned home with a medal on his chest, but no decent job because of his skin color. His mother was an elementary school teacher who would often remind him, "You don't get to make mistakes like everyone else. You've got to be twice, 3 times as good, just to be treated the same." Malcolm grew up in a world where every glance was a quiet accusation. But instead of bitterness, he chose resolve. At 18, Malcolm earned a full scholarship to Georgetown University, majoring in international relations. He studied under flickering dorm lights, worked 3 jobs to send money home, and still graduated top of his class. No one dared underestimate the quiet black student who spoke little, but when he did, every word hit its mark. After college, he joined the CIA, not out of a hunger for power, but for one simple reason. If the system won't protect people like me, then I need to learn how to control it. Malcolm would spend nearly 2 decades stationed in some of the world's most volatile hotspots. Baghdad, Kabul, Mogadishu, Kiev. He didn't carry a rifle, but his signature on a report could stop presidents cold. He once negotiated with rebels deep in the Colombian jungle. Exposed a mole inside the U.S. Department of Defense, rescued a captured operative in the Middle East with nothing more than a single encrypted message. Despite his accomplishments, he was often the only black man in the room. More than once, he was mistaken for the coffee guy. At 54, the president appointed Malcolm as director of the National Intelligence Center, a decision that sparked murmurs throughout Washington's back rooms. A black man. Too dangerous, too defiant, too independent. And that's precisely why he was chosen. Malcolm never wore armor. He wore a tailored gray suit. No slogans. No theatrics, just action. And the most powerful action was silence in the face of humiliation, forcing the entire system to answer for itself. When the officer whispered, "Did you say, 'You're the director?'" Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't have to prove himself. His silence echoed like thunder through the airport. By now the crowd understood. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a crime rooted in systemic injustice. And this time they picked the wrong man. A man who could, and would, make the nation listen. One day, I won't be in this position anymore. But the truth is, if I don't act today, then tomorrow, some black boy will be thrown to the ground outside his school, just for walking the wrong way. Today, he wasn't thrown to the ground, but he was handcuffed, humiliated, suspected, like so many other innocent people, for no reason other than the color of their skin. The only difference: he has the power to make justice move, not for fame, but because millions of others do not. The terminal fell silent. The boarding announcements, the rolling suitcases, the quiet hum of conversations all seemed to collapse under the invisible pressure when Malcolm Everett spoke. "I am the director of the United States National Intelligence Center." The words weren't loud, but to Officers Ricks and Moore, they hit like a starter pistol, ending a game whose rules they never understood. Ricks's face changed instantly. Flushed red, then pale as ash. His mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but no words could save him now. Moore, the younger officer, jerked his hand away from Malcolm's arm like he'd touched a live wire. His eyes darted between Malcolm, the cold steel cuffs, and the sea of phones recording everything. A silent but overwhelming panic began to ripple across the terminal. Ricks stammered, "That's not possible." "You're who?" Malcolm didn't respond right away. He simply turned, his hands still cuffed behind his back, and looked directly into the eyes of the man who had just humiliated him. There was no anger in that gaze, no hatred. Only the cold clarity of someone who had walked through war, politics, and violence, and now stood face to face with an old, familiar insult. "You just handcuffed a federal official," he said, voice even and sharp, "and you did it not because of any legitimate cause, but because of prejudice." A voice shouted from across the terminal, "What the hell is going on here?" A higher-ranking officer was approaching. His badge read, Lieutenant David Franklin, head of airport security on the afternoon shift. Franklin wasn't young, he wasn't in a hurry. He looked at the scene before him like a man who had seen many crises, but never this. A black man in handcuffs, two white officers, pale as ghosts. A crowd is filming, and a thick, heavy silence soaked in guilt. "Someone, explain this." "Now," Franklin growled. Moore swallowed hard. Ricks didn't move. Malcolm broke the silence. "I'll explain, but I'd like these cuffs removed first." "This has gone on long enough." Franklin stared at him. "And you are?" "Malcolm Everett, director of the National Intelligence Center." Franklin froze. For a moment he forgot to breathe. "Uncuff him, now." Moore fumbled with the keys. His hands shook so badly he dropped them twice. At last the cuffs clicked open. Malcolm gently rubbed his wrists. On his deep brown skin, the red marks were still clearly visible. Franklin spoke softly, almost a whisper. "Director Everett, I truly don't know what to say." Malcolm looked at him. No smile. No forgiveness. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to see what you do next." Franklin turned to Ricks and Moore. His voice now steel. "Turn in your badges, your weapons, and your radios. You are suspended effective immediately." "Sir, This is not a negotiation." The entire terminal seemed to stop breathing as Ricks unpinned his badge from his uniform. His fingers trembled. Moore kept his head down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. 2 other officers escorted them out. Phones kept recording. Eyes kept watching. But now the focus had shifted, from the fear of an innocent man to the earthquake that would ripple from this terminal all the way to the White House. Franklin said, "Director Everett, I will personally report this incident. All body cam footage will be preserved. No edits, no excuses." Malcolm simply nodded. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He was the kind of voice you couldn't ignore. There was no triumph on his face. Only the haunting calm of a man who had been underestimated too many times. And this time, they picked the wrong one. "I don't need privilege," Malcolm said. "I need justice, and not just for me." It wasn't just going viral. It had erupted. The first video surfaced online just 45 minutes after Malcolm Everett was handcuffed. In the 2-minute clip, a black man in a gray suit is clearly seen being restrained, interrogated, and handcuffed by 2 white police officers right in the middle of a crowded airport. But what shocked the nation wasn't just the image. It was the final words caught on video. "I am the director of the United States National Intelligence Center. And you've just made a serious mistake." The Washington Post's headline read, "Handcuffing a senior U.S. official, just because his skin is dark." CNN, MSNBC, The New York Times, and hundreds of local outlets reported the incident within 12 hours. From YouTube to Twitter, from podcasts to primetime talk shows, everyone was talking about Malcolm Everett. The justice for Malcolm quickly rose to the #1 trending topic nationwide. The president was briefed immediately. That night, an emergency meeting was held at the White House. The Department of Justice, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Office of Legal Counsel were all present. Malcolm Everett wasn't. He didn't need to be. The truth had already spoken for him. At the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, an internal firestorm erupted. Police Chief Tanya Holder received a call from the Attorney General's office at 2 a.m. The order: immediate suspension of both officers Ricks and Moore. A full independent investigation was to be launched under federal oversight. Chief Holder, the first black woman to lead the APD, couldn't hide her outrage at the press conference. "We're not just responding to this incident. We're confronting history." Malcolm Everett's office remained silent. No press release, no official statement. Just one short internal memo to all staff: "Maintain discipline. We respond not with rage, but with principle." But behind the scenes, a massive machine had begun to move. DOJ attorneys, in coordination with the Federal Civil Rights Division, began a full review of the officers' body cam footage, cross-referencing it with witness accounts and both officers' disciplinary records. Within 48 hours, the first findings were made public. Gary Ricks had been the subject of 9 civil complaints for excessive force, racial bias, and abuse of authority. Most were resolved internally and never made public. Evan Moore, though newer to the force, was noted for his tendency to follow orders blindly, even when those orders were questionable. Special hearings were convened in Congress. The chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a former prosecutor, made a striking statement. "If a director of national intelligence can be treated this way because of the color of his skin, how many ordinary Americans have been humiliated, degraded, and forgotten?" Black, Latinx, and Asian lawmakers took the floor one by one. They weren't just angry. They were heartbroken. Eventually, Malcolm Everett appeared before the cameras. Not on television, not in a press conference, but in a closed-door hearing with senior senators. He didn't shout. He didn't demand compensation. He didn't blame the system. He simply recounted every detail. every glance, every question, every tightening of the cuffs. And he ended with a sentence that froze the room. If I hadn't been me that day, this story would never have been told. The political impact exceeded all expectations. A new bill, the Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Act of 2025, was rushed into drafting. It proposed mandatory independent surveillance cameras in all federal facilities, airports, checkpoints, etc., where citizens may be detained. Immediate suspension, not just internal reassignment, for law enforcement officers accused of racial bias while under investigation. A federal training budget for mandatory implicit bias education across all armed and security forces. But the greatest impact wasn't on Capitol Hill. It was in the eyes of a 10-year-old boy, brown-skinned, standing in a living room, watching the video of the man in handcuffs at the airport. "Dad," he asked, "why didn't he yell?" The father didn't answer right away. He just looked at the screen, where Malcolm Everett stood firm, silent, unshaken, amid shouting voices, answering not with anger, but with pride. And finally, the father said, "Because sometimes silence is the loudest blow." There was no bombshell opening, no dramatic gavel slams. But make no mistake, the air inside that federal courtroom was electric. Thick with tension, with anticipation, with something rare and raw, reckoning. At the defense table sat Gary Ricks, a former Atlanta police sergeant. His navy blue suit didn't fit quite right. The man who once strutted through airports like he owned them now sat hunched, visibly aged, his eyes scanning the room not with confidence, but with dread. Next to him, Evan Moore, the younger officer, looked pale and clammy. He clutched a crumpled tissue in one hand as though trying to hold on to something, anything, solid. And then, across the room, he walked in. Malcolm Everett. Not with a fleet of guards, not behind a podium. Just himself, tall, composed, dignified. But his presence filled the courtroom like a tide. He wore a dark charcoal suit. No lapel pins, no entourage. Just a folder in his hand and a gaze that cut through the wood-paneled silence like a razor. The prosecution opened with a single sentence. If this man had been anyone else, you would have never heard about this case. They let that hang in the air. Then came the evidence, the unedited body cam footage, the audio recordings, the testimony of witnesses who had stood in line at Gate C18 and watched the abuse unfold in real time. The footage spoke louder than any lawyer could. What are you doing here? You fit the description. Do you have something to hide? Why so nervous, huh? Get the cuffs. Those words echoed through the courtroom like ghosts of every racial stop and frisk that never made the news. Then came the star witness. Malcolm stepped up to the stand. No theatrics. No righteous anger, only truth. I was stopped. Not because of what I did, but because of what I looked like. I was questioned as though my existence required an explanation. I was handcuffed in public, humiliated, stripped of dignity. And if I didn't have this title, I'd be invisible, like the thousands of others who never get justice. Every word landed with weight. Measured, calm, devastating. He didn't speak just for himself. He spoke for every black man who's been cornered, accused, dismissed, for every moment when silence was mistaken for guilt. For every mother who taught her son to comply even when it hurts. The defense tried to pivot. They called the incident a tragic misunderstanding. They claimed the report was vague but real, that Ricks and Moore meant well but overreacted under pressure. The jury didn't buy it, because truth has a rhythm, and that courtroom had heard its beat. Then came the final confrontation. During cross-examination, Ricks was asked to rise and face Malcolm. It was the first time the two had stood eye to eye since that afternoon at the airport. But it was no longer a confrontation between an officer and a suspect. It was a reckoning between power and justice. "Do you recognize this man?" the prosecutor asked. Ricks nodded slowly. "Yes." "Would you have treated him the same way if he were white?" Ricks hesitated. His lips parted. No words came. The silence was louder than any confession. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty, on all counts. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Assault and unlawful detainment. Abuse of authority with racial bias. As the words rang out, Ricks slumped. Moore wept. Justice, for once, had a face and a spine. Weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, Malcolm chose to speak again. Not to punish, but to remind. "This is not about vengeance," he said. "It's about principle. I didn't come here for retribution. I came here so that the next man like me doesn't have to be here at all." He paused, letting that sink in. Let this courtroom be the last place someone needs a title to be treated like a human being. Ricks was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Moore, 3 years with eligibility for rehabilitation. Their careers? Over. Their uniforms. Stripped. Their legacy? A cautionary tale. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged forward. "Director Everett, do you have anything to say to the nation?" He didn't blink. "Yes," he said. "Record everything, speak up, and never ever think that silence will save you." Justice didn't arrive in a blaze. It walked, quietly, firmly, into a courtroom and rewrote the ending. He never asked for a podium, never called himself a victim, never raised his voice. But Malcolm Everett became a symbol anyway, not because he wanted the attention, but because his silence had said what millions screamed for decades. The video of the trial went viral, not just the body cam footage, but the moment, the precise second when Malcolm looked Gary Ricks in the eye and refused to flinch. "Would you have treated him the same way if he were white?" A pause. A man is trembling, and a nation finally seeing. News anchors wept on live TV. Veterans wrote letters, students wrote essays. A high school history teacher in Minneapolis rewrote her curriculum. Daycares in Baltimore posted signs, "We're raising the next Malcolm." One mural in Oakland, sprayed across a brick wall in bold strokes, read, "Not all heroes raise their voices, some just stand." But Malcolm wasn't interested in being canonized. He didn't go on a press tour. He didn't sign a book deal. He didn't trademark his name. Instead, he requested one thing: a closed-door meeting with the President of the United States. The meeting took place on a rainy Thursday. No photographers, no press releases. Behind the doors of the Roosevelt Room, Malcolm sat across from the Commander-in-Chief, a man he'd advised in intelligence briefings, but never spoken to as himself. "Sir," Malcolm said, "I've devoted my life to protecting this country's secrets. Now I ask you to help me protect its people." He didn't lecture. He didn't beg. He laid out a plan. The Everett Initiative. Mandatory federal tracking of all use-of-force incidents involving race-based complaints. Independent civilian oversight boards in every major metropolitan police department. Federal protection and incentives for bystander recordings and whistleblowers. Psychological screening and anti-bias training are made mandatory every 2 years for all law enforcement officers. The Everett Civil Protection Fund is a grant program to support victims of wrongful detention and harassment. The president didn't interrupt. When Malcolm finished, the room was still. And then, a quiet nod. You have my word. Within 10 days, the Everett Initiative became executive policy. The reaction was tectonic. Some called it the most meaningful reform since the Civil Rights Act. Others called it too little, too late. But what no one could deny was this: America was paying attention. At town halls in Detroit, mothers stood and spoke, not in whispers, but in declaration. I raised my son to keep his head down. Now I want him to walk tall, like Malcolm. In Congress, a bipartisan coalition emerged for the first time in over a decade to co-sponsor the Everett Federal Equality in Law Enforcement Act. A Republican senator from Ohio stood before the Senate and said, "I've been blind to this, but I watched that video. I saw the fear. And I saw the strength. We owe our country more than just order. We owe it justice." But not everyone applauded. Certain police unions cried foul. Cable news spun narratives. Internet trolls turned vitriol into memes. Malcolm received threats. His address was leaked. He was followed more than once, but he never changed his routine. Never hired private security, never flinched. "You can't scare a man who's already been cuffed for being himself," he told one colleague. Then came the letter, from a 12-year-old boy in Birmingham, Alabama, written in shaky cursive on wide-ruled paper. "Dear Mr. Everett, when my brother got stopped last year, they said he looked suspicious. He cried when he came home. So did Mom. But then we saw you, and now he wants to be an FBI agent, not to be powerful. To be safe." Malcolm framed it, not for his office, but for his kitchen wall, next to the coffee pot, where he'd see it every morning. 6 months later, Malcolm stood before the graduating class at Quantico, not as director, not as a public figure, but as a black man who had lived through the system and still chose to shape it. "You'll be tested," he told the recruits. "Not just by criminals, but by your own instincts. Ask yourself, when the time comes, will you protect the law or just your badge?" He let the silence answer for them. Then he walked off stage, no applause expected. But they stood anyway, all of them, recruits, instructors, even old-timers in the back row. They stood because Malcolm Everett didn't demand respect. He reminded them of what it looked like. He never wanted to be a symbol. But America made him one, because truth, when walked with dignity, leaves footprints others want to follow. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where sunlight slants gently across the marble steps, and the wind carries not just leaves, but memory. Inside the great hall of the museum, every seat was filled. Civil rights leaders, lawmakers, activists, students, even a few veterans from the Montgomery bus boycott, sat in solemn silence, waiting. Phones tucked away, eyes forward, not a soul stirred, and then he entered. Malcolm Everett, no longer the man who was handcuffed in an airport, no longer the director whose silence thundered. Today he was just a citizen, but one the country had learned to listen to. He stepped up to the podium, pausing to take in the faces. The same faces that once watched another generation march, bleed, pray, and fall. And then he began. They didn't know who they had handcuffed that day, but the truth is, neither did I. The room froze. This wasn't the speech they expected, but Malcolm had never spoken to satisfy. He spoke to wake people up. "I knew I was a director. I knew I'd served my country. But I didn't know, until they put those cuffs on me, that I had become a statistic in a story I thought I was too powerful to belong to." A quiet breath passed through the crowd. "I used to believe that power could shield you, that if you worked hard enough, followed the rules long enough, They'd finally stop asking you to prove your worth. He looked out. But America doesn't always care about your resume. Sometimes it only sees your reflection. He let that truth land like iron on granite. What happened to me wasn't new, it was just loud. What's new is that the country didn't look away this time. He listed what had changed. New federal mandates on racial profiling investigations. Body cam footage is now publicly accessible in over 300 jurisdictions. A 20% increase in minority recruits in federal law enforcement training. The Everett initiative was signed into law by a Congress that rarely agreed on anything. Yes, we changed something, but no, we didn't fix everything. Then he shifted. His eyes found the front row where a mother sat, her arms wrapped around her teenage son. There are still people who don't make it home, who doesn't have a video, who doesn't have a title to drop, and who never gets a courtroom, just a casket. A few heads bowed, a few eyes swelled. So if you think the work is done, you're not paying attention. He spoke now not like a leader, but like a father, a neighbor, a man who has seen too much to settle. America didn't need another hero. It needed a mirror. He called out institutions that still reward silence. He named the counties where lawsuits vanish. He acknowledged the fatigue of the black community, the exhaustion of having to explain pain in terms that white comfort can digest. Don't thank me. Don't quote me. Don't put me on murals. Just do the damn work. That line earned the first wave of murmurs, some gasps, but mostly nods because they knew he wasn't wrong. Then he softened. I still believe in this country. Pause. I have to, because I've seen what it becomes when we stop believing in it. This flag has wrapped the fallen. It's flown over battlegrounds, but it means nothing if it doesn't protect every American under it. He closed his folder, but not his message. My final thought is this: if you have power, use it to protect. If you have a voice, raise it for the silenced. And if you have privilege, risk it, or it's worthless. He stepped back. No music, no fanfare. Just a standing ovation that rose like a tide. Not because Malcolm demanded it, but because he reminded the nation that real leadership doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up, again and again, until the system can no longer ignore the truth. Outside the museum, a small group gathered. A man in his 70s leaned against a cane, tears in his eyes. We used to march for this, he whispered. We dreamed someone like him would come. Next to him, a young girl, maybe 12, held a notebook. I'm writing a report, she said. It's called Why Malcolm Everett is What America Needs to Be. The fight wasn't over. It never is. But for the first time in a long time, America had paused, had listened, had shifted, not completely, but enough to matter. This is not just the story of Malcolm Everett. It is the story of every black man stopped, not for what he's done, but for who he is. It is the story of power abused and dignity reclaimed. And now, it's yours too. If this makes you uncomfortable, good. If it makes you angry, don't just scroll past. Share this story, start the conversation, support reform where you live. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins when ordinary people decide they will no longer stay silent. They didn't know who they handcuffed that day, but now we do. And the question is, what will we do with that knowledge? Like, share. Speak out, because real justice depends on all of us.